Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jamie Lava, and I lead the local infrastructure hub for Bloomberg Philanthropies. This session is brought to you by our partners at the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Results for America. Today, we're going to dive into a critical conversation about how to successfully manage and implement grants throughout the administration transition. As leadership and priorities shift, ensuring that your grant-funded projects stay on track requires careful planning and strategic decision-making. We'll discuss the impact of the executive orders on funding opportunities, analyze the direction of federal funding, and explore strategies to adapt to new administration priorities. What we're going to really do today is help you know that you're doing what you need to do on your end to make sure that you stay in compliance with your federal projects. So whether you're overseeing an infrastructure project, a sustainability initiative, or other kinds of community programs, today's discussion will provide you with tried and true strategies to keep your funding secure and your projects moving forward. As always, we want this to be an interactive session. We've reserved approximately half of our time for Q&A. So throughout the session, please post your questions, your comments, how you guys are thinking about this moment in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A session. Now I'm pleased to welcome our incredible partner. Since the COVID pandemic started and we started thinking about cities accessing federal funds to respond to the pandemic, Matthew Hansen, a managing director at Witt O'Brien's, has been with us, giving us all great advice on how to manage grants and really deal with the incredible opportunities and challenges that come with federal funding. So thank you for being with us today, Matt. I'm going to hand it over to you.
No, I appreciate it. And before I get started, just some late breaking news that the U.S. Department of Treasury has added new reporting and compliance documentation on their website, not only for the next reporting cycle, but also sort of tipping the hands on how they're going to review the 12/31/24 obligation. So for those of you on the call that are still working on ARPA, state and local fiscal recovery, please check out the Treasury website to get the latest and greatest information. Excited to be here to discuss this topic. 2 weeks ago, I was in DC for two conferences where federal financial assistance was the topic, which is pretty unusual when you go to DC. Usually grants are not a topic that elected leaders and others are discussing, but it really is top of mind for everybody and a critically important subject right now. As Jamie mentioned, going to touch really quickly on key executive orders and some of their impacts. If we went into every single executive order, this could be a 3-day session, as many executive orders that have been issued in the last couple of months. At a high level, analyze the direction of federal funding, what we're seeing, where we think it's going moving forward, and then some strategies to embrace the change and advocate for the future. Really going to talk about looking for safe harbors, relying on membership associations like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, and others. Really a critical time to be in partnership with them. And then advocating, something that grant professionals don't normally do, is normally considered a taboo for grant professionals to actively advocate for their programs, for their grants, for their communities. It's oftentimes seen as bothering the funders, getting on the wrong side of funders, maybe crossing the line into lobbying. But right now is a critical time not only to advocate for your communities, your programs, your grants, but also for what the federal financial landscape going forward is going to look like. Next slide, please. So while we've seen an incredible amount of activity, a lot of it seemingly indiscriminate in nature and also very publicly hashed out, some of the actions we're seeing are not necessarily unprecedented. So, you go back a couple decades and it was very much a common practice for certain federal agencies to serve as fiscal agents for other federal agencies. Not all federal agencies served as their own grantor. They relied on HHS and Justice and a handful of other federal agencies to be their fiscal agents. It seems very much like we might be moving back to some of that. Greater state control. This goes all the way back to the Reagan administration with Presidential Executive Order 12372, where every state had a single point of contact to interact with the federal agencies. Reduction in force, certainly with previous administrations, the Clinton administration, the federal workforce was reduced, by almost 200,000 employees. And under the Bush administration, competitive sourcing, the infamous OMB Circular A76, where 10% of all jobs that were not inherently governmental had to be outsourced, and the federal employees actually had to put together their own proposal to compete against private industry to retain their job. I was at the Justice Department at the time, and all grant activity was considered not inherently governmental, and we had to put together a proposal called the most efficient organization and compete against private sector to keep our jobs. Across the board rescissions, we've certainly seen that numerous times before. And then with every incoming administration, certainly, especially when it's changing political parties, there's a certain amount of program and policy changes. Don't want to make light of what's going on right now. It clearly is something like we've never seen before. But as municipal government professionals and grants administrators, we certainly have had to navigate these waters before, and we'll do a great job navigating again this time. Next slide. So starting at day one, there has been a series of executive orders and other OMB memos and department and agency memos. These are just some of the highlights on the screen. Certainly not going to go into them. The membership associations like U.S. Conference of Mayors and others have great resources on their website where they're tracking these, and I encourage you to go check it out. Most notably, on January 20th, was the rescission of essentially implementation direction and order for many programs, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and CHIPS Act. The OMB memos that at the time appeared to cancel those programs altogether, that also appeared to freeze all funding. Certainly, there's been a series of court cases and temporary restraining orders since then, and as we're seeing, more and more cabinet secretaries sort of take the helm of their agencies, some of the confusion, some of the chaos is certainly settling down a little bit, but by no means all of it. Just in the last, 2 to 3 weeks, there has been an executive order discussing how the Department of Government Efficiency would implement their cost efficiency strategies. This is sort of a step-by-step guide, but I want to highlight that it calls out specifically contracting grant justification and transparency. So it lays out how the federal grantor agencies are going to have to report to DOGE and to OMB justifying contracts as well as grant programs and individual grants. There has been an executive order about the reduction of the federal bureaucracy. Certainly that's been in the news and continues to be in the news. The big impact, not only are the specific agencies like IMLS and CDFI that are being called out to be reduced to their statutorily minimum requirement, but it is just compounding the issue of many federal grantor staff are operating under gag orders, and now they're having their reporting specialists removed, or their compliance specialist removed, or the person handling NEPA. So from a grantee perspective, it's increasingly hard to get the answers that we need going forward. A lot of news about Homeland Security, FEMA, disaster recovery assistance. Certainly, the cards are reading as if there's going to be a change, in one way, shape, or another. Much of what we're hearing right now is a collapsing down to just 3 region model, but a lot of discussions in DC happening right now. The proposed elimination of the Department of Education really needs no commentary. Eliminating waste and saving taxpayer dollars by consolidating procurement. This is really taking procurement authority away from the individual agencies and consolidating it under the General Services Administration, as well as consolidating the different procurement vehicles that the General Services Administration has at their disposal. What this will mean is it'll be harder for agencies to bring on training, technical assistance, capacity type agencies, and further slow the rollout of programs. Specific actions from OPM to really oversee the federal workforce. This is really an attempt that if the courts rule in favor of the administration or rules against the administration, that they can't just make these discriminate cuts. They're trying to empower OPM so that they can go in and make those cuts anyways. Just recently, stopping waste, fraud, and abuse by eliminating information silos. This is a really interesting one because there's a specific section that has to do with unfettered access to comprehensive data from all state programs that receive federal funding. So, the read on this is it goes very much, beyond just breaking down the silos at the federal level so that, agencies would share information, but really trying to extract data from state programs where the state might collect lots of demographic information and other types of performance measurement that is not necessarily shared with the federal government. So we'll see how that plays out. And then just the last two that have happened in probably the last day or so, a notice put out by the Small Business Administration about their reorganization, really shrinking the size of the organization, which will have an impact on many of the SBA programs that cities depend on. But then also sort of creating the foundation for them to assume responsibility over student loans going forward if the Department of Education cuts go through as being discussed. And finally, just yesterday, an MOU was signed between Housing and Urban Development and Homeland Security to partner and provide information about who is receiving HUD-funded services. So really targeting undocumented who are taking advantage of HUD-funded programs. So again, this could be a several days long discussion to go into the detail of all these, but really, I encourage you to reach out to the U.S. Conference of Mayors and others to get the most up-to-date information and just be situationally aware of some of the various executive orders and OMB memos that are out there. Next slide, please. So what we are generally seeing from the executive orders and other actions, first and foremost, fiscal austerity. So we're seeing, programs being cut, reduced, frozen. All of this is in the name of, budget negotiations and identifying funding to offset tax cuts and other administration priorities. Certainly, there are some very politically motivated targets, such as DEI, climate justice, sanctuary city type programs. But all of the rest of the noise is budget negotiations, and it's just indiscriminate trying to identify funding that can be used for offsets. Increased transparency and accountability. This is really should not be a surprise with every change in administration where the political party changes. The incoming administration really tries to, find fault, find issues that their predecessors did not do well. You have the added layer now with Doge, and you can't go, 10 minutes without refreshing your news feeds. to see somebody posting about some mistake, some, fraudulent program, some waste of taxpayer resources. And it's just very much the environment we're in right now, and we will continue to be in for some time. Stricter compliance and eligibility requirements. Obviously, I mentioned previously things like sanctuary city, but uh, in general, we're going to see programs being stricter, have additional compliance requirements, and not broad use programs like we enjoyed with the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery and the CARES Act and those various programs that the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties did such a great job of advocating for us to really get the money out and to the people who need it most. The programs are going to go in the opposite direction. And then lastly, policy shifts, and certainly we're seeing that, and you would expect some of that with any administration going in different directions. Next slide. So overall, the direction of federal financial assistance, as mentioned, greater emphasis on compliance and measured outcomes. I've been doing grants for 31 years, and we've been talking for 31 years about how we as grant professionals and cities need to do a better job of measuring outcomes, measuring the impact on the people, the community, the folks that are the beneficiaries of the program. And that was never as important as it is today. So we really need to get back to basics and really focus on results and outcomes of this much needed critical funding streams that come into our community. Diversification of funding sources. Federal financial assistance is not going to go away. Certainly, we are hearing that more of it's going to be formulaic and pass through the states instead of the discretionary competitive grants directly to the federal government. But really, it's a time for cities to be looking at state funding, county funding, philanthropic funding, foundation funding, and really looking across all sectors and not just solely focused on federal grant dollars. Increased demand for grant management expertise. Certainly, every community is going through a lack of public sector capacity. Now is really a critical time for cities to invest in existing staff or new staff and make sure they have the time to know the latest compliance, know the latest happenings in federal governments. Grants are oftentimes other duty is assigned, and really now is not that time. So if you have people in your organizations that are managing grants, make sure that function is in their position description, make sure they know that is a critical part of their job, get them the training and professional development that they need, because your community is going to have to rely on these folks over the coming years. Increased competition for limited funding. Obviously, that's kind of a no-brainer if funding is drying up. Expansion of state and local grant opportunities. So this is kind of critically important if in fact more of the money is going to be formulaic and block grants through states. Encourage everybody to be having conversation with their state counterparts, because if we take all the flaws of the federal government and we just pass it down a level to 50 states, and within states we have siloed approaches where every state agency is managing different, there's no centralized systems, no centralized reporting. It's really going to be a mess for us trying to secure funding and then manage it. So if we believe that we're moving to a more formulaic and block grant world, it's critical to be having those conversations right now with your state officials to make sure the proper systems and capacity is put in place. And then finally, the need for advocacy and policy engagement. Like I mentioned earlier, grant professionals don't usually speak up. They usually don't contact their funders, engage their congressional offices unless it has to do with a congressional earmark. The position of the current administration is, with their indiscriminate cuts of programs, if they don't hear anything, if they don't hear any noise, if they don't hear anybody speaking up about the impact of these cuts, then they assume it's a cut, it's a program nobody cares about, and they're happy to just eliminate it. So it's really important to, be funneling that information up through the associations, through the local congressional delegations, talking about the people at the end of the project who are the ones impacted. And from what folks have shared, there is a little bit of hope within the White House Intergovernmental Affairs Office that there's some folks that are open and receptive to this information. And we have started to see, grants here and there and programs here and there be unfrozen when that information is being funneled up appropriately. So really encourage the folks on this call and your grant teammates within your organization to really ramp up the advocacy and policy engagement piece right now. Next slide. So what does it mean for local governments? You always should have had a grant plan. What are your key priorities? What are the programs you want to accomplish? But now more than ever, as we're seeing grants be cut back, it's important to have a strategic plan. It's important to, have a formalized go, no-go process so that you're not chasing grants that either ultimately might get cut or might not materialize at all. We're seeing lots of grants right now that are on pause, that are frozen. And we're still seeing cities working on those grant applications just in case. So you really need to have an internal conversation. Is that, something we want our internal resources to be working on? Not knowing, whether that grant program will ever happen in the future. Alignment to new priorities. It's critical to find common ground where you can. With all grant research pursuance, grant writing, the key is always speaking to the priorities of the funder, trying to align mission, vision, priorities. I know that's easier said than done, but it's a critical thing to do right now where there's common ground possible. Otherwise, you're just going to be shut out of almost all funding opportunities going forward. Again, I can't mention it enough, and I'll talk about it on a future slide. Deep understanding of compliance. The current administration is looking for any reason to terminate your grant, and you can't give them that room. So we all need to be doing it better than we ever have before. And that is understanding all the compliance and other requirements of the grant. The usual scenario where somebody else was managing the grant and they handed it off to you and you just managed the grant the same way they did, that's not the environment. Like, you need to familiarize yourself with all the source materials, take a fresh look and make sure you're in compliance. And then advocacy, obviously, I've talked about quite a bit. Next slide.
Excuse mommy.
So how will
Can I bring this up for a minute?
yeah. Oh, I will keep going, I guess. How will the Department of Government Efficiency and committees of government efficiency affect local government funding? So not only are we up against the DOGE at the federal level, but in many states, especially where you have Republican majorities in the legislature, we're seeing the copycat committees on government efficiency. And these are the committees at the state level will probably ultimately have as much, if not more, impact than what DOGE is doing at the federal level. But in theory, we should see streamlining of grant applications and reporting processes. We've already seen FSRS and FAFATA moving to SAM.gov, increased oversight and performance-based funding models. Again, the data, the outcome is going to be critical to get continuation funding. Greater emphasis on reducing administrative burdens. In theory, I think it'll just be a bait and switch. While some administrative burdens will go away, we'll see a whole nother series of administrative burdens, mostly on reporting and justifying expenses, that sort of thing. And then potential shifts in funding distribution, again, back to the state pastor. Next slide. So here's the meat of what I wanted to get into today. So some strategies to embrace and affect change. So as just mentioned, review your grant agreements and compliance requirements. Go back and review the notice of funding opportunity, the grant agreement, agency policy documents, and self-monitor yourself to make sure you're in compliance. Call a colleague from the city next door and have them monitor you. Oftentimes we inherit a grant, as I mentioned, and we manage as they mentioned. We really have to get back to basics and make sure we're doing everything the way it's supposed to be done. Stay in compliance. Many agency personnel are operating under gag orders. They cannot communicate with you, even if they wanted to. Continue to submit all items to them, even if you're not getting a response. So prior authorizations for procurement, property disposition, quarterly reports, even if your program is quote unquote on pause, keep submitting those reports, keep submitting that documentation, even if it's just a copied forward, zero changes from the previous quarter. Keep that grant in compliance no matter what. Do not give them a reason to terminate your award. Stay informed on policy changes. Obviously, from the beginning of this presentation, things are very volatile, so check back often. Work with your intergovernmental affairs specialist if you have one, and your membership associations to make sure you have the latest and greatest information. In addition to the White House website, go to Office of Personnel Management, go to the Office of Management and Budget. Information is coming at us from every direction, and you need to make sure you have the latest information. Next slide, please. Engage with key stakeholders. Not all program freezes or grant terminations are created equal. As I mentioned earlier, they're taking no outcry, no news as affirmation that the cuts they made are fine and nobody cares. Cities are having some success in keeping funding moving forward by working through membership organizations and key political leaders. If you haven't talked to your local congressional delegation lately, have a conversation with them, invite them in to tour projects that are going to be impacted by potential funding cuts. And again, look for common ground, where you can reach across the aisle with your congressional delegation so that that information can be bubbled up and hopefully keep your grants active, especially in the environment we're in right now where in the continuing resolution, for all intents and purposes, earmarks have been eliminated. Your congressional delegation, is going to be willing to work with you to try and find replacement funding or do whatever they can to salvage the funding that's out there right now. Prepare for increased scrutiny. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Evaluate current and future funding. With grants, words have always mattered. As a grant professional, we've always been taught to write to the mission, vision, priorities of the funder. This is no different than what we're operating in today. So review your application, budget, reports, etc., to make sure they align as best as possible to the funder. I know that's not always possible, and I know certain jurisdictions, believe very deeply in certain priorities, certain issues. So I'm not asking you to change that. But where there is room to evaluate how you report out, how you measure programs, and again, sort of rule of thumb, focus on the outcome, focus on the individuals who are the ultimate beneficiary of this funding, and really focus on that, not only from a data collection perspective, but also a reporting perspective. Last slide, seek out safe harbors. So the order of legal precedence that normally exist is completely upside down right now. I put it here on the slide, but we don't know right now where a federal regulation has trumped a federal statute, has trumped an executive order, and it will take some time for the courts to resolve some of this. And I know many folks are trying to keep, procurement policies and other policies up to date, and it's almost an impossible job right now. So really look for safe harbors, whether that be, your established policies and procedures, whether that be the program guidance specifically coming out from a grantor agency. And when in doubt, the uniform guidance. The OMB uniform guidance is not going anywhere. So really encourage folks, when you have a question, should I do X or should I do Y? Really go to the uniform guidance. And when you run into these situations, really document your best attempts to get updated information, look to see, how you needed to be in compliance, any actions you took in lieu of any specific, clarity around these things. Certainly, single auditors and the OIG community are in the same boat we're in right now, and they will be sympathetic. So really encourage you to document your due diligence, your best efforts, the approach you took. And if ultimately it comes out as being flagged as a finding in a future audit, then we put together a corrective action plan and go from there. Procurement is probably the one area that is most in motion right now. A lot of the executive orders having to do with various civil rights impacts procurement. So here's an area where I would certainly encourage you to seek out safe harbors, two of which are on the screen. One is cooperative purchasing, things like NASPO or GSA or HJAC, or where some other procurement authority has done the RFP and you're pulling the contract down from their site, or piggybacking on state procurement, where state procurement has a little bit different set of rules than local government does. But where it makes sense and where you can piggyback on somebody else's procurement, that'll save you some effort in trying to make sure your own procurement policies are up to date. Existing policies and internal controls. The audit community, when in doubt, they're going to look at your adherence. The number one thing they're concerned about is arbitrary and capricious decision making. So if you can really document that you have policies and internal controls and that you followed them in the absence of any specifically updated guidance from the federal government, that's going to be your best bet. So really dust off those internal policies and procedures, make sure they're as up to date as possible. Train staff who needs to be trained on it, adhere to it as much as possible. And if you do have to deviate for some reason, document the deviation and the rationale for that deviation. And then finally, collaborate with auditors. So for cities and towns that are hitting the single audit threshold, and you have an audit firm who does your single audit, sit down, have a conversation with them. What are they hearing? What would they like to see as far as updated policies and procedures and how you administer federal funding? OIG communities. So at the recent National Grants Management Association conference, they had a great panel. There's been a lot of news about the OIG heads themselves being released, but those OIG offices are still there at each of the federal agencies. So reach out to them and ask, what are they hearing? What would they advise? And then finally, the PRAC, the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee is, their specific mission has to do with the COVID funding, but a lot of the material they're putting out is really, good best practices on internal controls and waste, fraud, and abuse prevention. So encourage you to check them out. And what's not on the slide, for those of you that have internal audit or people that are testing internal controls, sit down with them and again, have a conversation about what they recommend as best practices going forward. And with that, Jamie, I think is there one more slide or, one more slide. So probably the most important slide, I can't believe I forgot it. So educate and advocate. First of all, not all legal instruments are contracts. There's a lot of confusion right now that grants are contracts. Not all grants are contracts. Grants are legal instruments that transfer financial resources from one entity to another for a programmatic purpose. There are some particular instances where a contractual obligation can be made through a grant. That's usually where the federal government issues a grant for a grantee to produce a policy and procedure manual or a capacity program or something that the federal government is going to use themselves. Should they have used a grant to procure for that good or service? Probably not, but it happens. But just the broad conversation that uh, grants or contracts is incorrect. And what that means to us is they can be suspended, terminated, much easier than a typical contractual relationship. So, you know, educate yourself on this, have conversations with your internal legal folks, and look at the language of your grant agreement so you fully understand, what is binding, what is not binding, is there arbitration available, all those sorts of things. Not all grants have been frozen or eliminated. Quite a few have, but there's still a lot of money moving. So make sure you understand what has and what has not been impacted. And also make sure that you are communicating this to your leadership, to elected officials, and the community as a whole, so that they know there are still certain grant programs that are moving forward. And for those that might be on pause or might be in trouble, have those conversations with congressional delegations and others. What is the project and who it is serving? So get back to basics, understanding this for yourself, but also communicating that to your electeds, to the community as a whole, on your website, transparency, make sure people know that who the grant is serving, what are the services they're providing, why it is important. Don't assume that people know, why a grant that you're working on is important. Make sure you get that information out. Why administrative and indirect costs are important. You've probably heard that there has been some news, especially among research universities, about putting a 15% cap on indirect cost. Many local governments operate under not only taking advantage of admin, but have negotiated indirect cost rates to cap that could have significant impacts to many of our communities. So stay up to date on that issue, but also let your electeds and others know how important that admin funding and indirect cost is. On the surface, 15% on indirect costs might sound like a great thing, but you all know that you likely have a 20 or a 25% indirect cost, and that haircut, will have consequences. And then finally, the last two items, advocacy is not lobbying. I don't want you going out and hire a lobbying firm. I don't want you going out, and scheduling meetings up on the Hill. That certainly crosses the line. But make sure your local community, your local leaders, congressional delegation, your funders know how critical these funds are and the potential impacts of the cuts of funding. And then finally, be part of the new normal. So the federal financial assistance process is changing. We're already seeing consolidation of systems. We're seeing, procurement being consolidated with GSA. We're likely going to see more money flowing through the states. Instead of just, sort of throwing our hands up and being frustrated that all of this stuff is happening to us, you all as local government leaders and grant professionals know what's working and what's not working. And there are opportunities to, influence that process right now. So really take advantage of that and let your voices be heard right now. And with that, Jamie,
Great.
I'll open up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Matt. I think a lot of the questions actually were sort of about this last slide that you got to. So that was great. I'm going to maybe just start with one. And it was about when should cities actually start acting on what a proclamation from the administration? Like when is guidance actionable? And when should they start, doing something based on either what the president may be saying or an EO or a memo from an agency?
Almost immediately. They are uh, these EOs go deep. Many of the executive orders are actually giving programmatic guidance to those agencies. So if you see something that's going to impact, the the agency you're receiving funding from or a particular program, certainly take that into consideration and act on it. One of the things we're doing is we're keeping a running tracker and a timeline, and we're updating program guidance, policies, and procedures with on such and such a date. This executive order happened, which does X, Y, and Z. Because of that executive order, we've changed, how we handle reporting or how we handle data collection. So really having a running timeline that matches up with your program policies and procedures is critical right now. And if you think about it, for those of you that manage the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery, very similar activity. So, they were issuing guidance as we were administering the funding. And we had kind of a side by side. We administered the funding until this date. Treasury came out with new guidance. We changed at that date. That's really what you need to be doing with the executive orders and the OMB guidance that's coming out right now. Lot of well-founded and beneficial legal action going on right now, getting temporary stays and reversals. I think what we're seeing from the administration is if they can't accomplish the goal in one way, they'll go another way. So just because there's a stay on, cutting staff or cutting a program, they'll come back at it another way. So really start to, as soon as they tip their cards on the direction they're heading, take that seriously and start acting on it.
And maybe I'm just gonna stay on this point for one more moment, just to say, what would that look like? So if a city, we're gonna take a city that has a Safe Streets and Roads for All grant, and we've started to see some signals from the administration about priorities around diversity, equity, inclusion, around families and safety, around a deep prioritization of some of the climate benefits. How should a city start to internalize that and act on that?
I think this gets back to a little bit around, terminology matters. We are always told to write to the priorities of the funder, write to the priorities of the grantee. Safe Streets for All is a program that's been around for a long time, different administrations. It's time to really, look at the project and focus on, the beneficiaries, the outcomes, and to whatever extent possible, pivot some of the language away from some of the DEIA or some of the climate outcomes and focus on, the programmatic purpose. I know that's not a great answer, but it's just kind of the reality we're living in right now. And if you can't do that, if that alignment doesn't make sense for your project or for your community, then certainly start looking at Plan B. Are there other grant programs out there, foundations or others that you might need to have some conversations with about funding the project as a alternative funding source?
Great. Another question was, how should cities be documenting their attempts to interact with the federal agencies? And you mentioned that in some cases there's gag orders in effect, or there might be a lack of responsiveness. Should cities be documenting that, and sort of how and to what end?
Yeah, I mean, it's something, and I know it's something we're all really bad at. I personally, I shoot off an email and I think nothing of it, but really with any grant, you should have a call log, a communication log, even in good times when you're getting responses back from the grantor agency, but set up that communication log and, just document all your outreach attempts. you know, submitted a request for a prior authorization on this date, didn't hear back for 30 days, was forced to move forward, uh, submitted a report, and in the report I requested additional assistance or guidance. Just keep that call log going and be able to present that to your own single auditors or federal monitors when they come to look, that you have this, this is my due diligence. This is everything I did, to stay in compliance and make sure I was communicating with the grantor. Having been in DC recently, a lot of the program managers that you've always worked with are still there, and they're as frustrated as you are. But they are operating under gag orders and they honestly cannot communicate back to you. But I know that they are still receiving your emails and your voicemails, and encourage you to keep doing that.
Great. One of the questions we got was about some of the data tools. There's been a lot of reports about different data sources being removed. And we know that some of those were sources that were used for especially IJA grants, like the EJ screen. How should cities think about collecting data in the absence of those, and how should they be thinking about what data will be required going forward?
It's a great question, and there are a few data champions out there who have really done a great job of grabbing some of these archive sites and resources and making them still available to us. So I certainly encourage folks to seek those out. Like, just an example is the IIJA White House Guidebook, which is gone. Like, it's just no longer there. But there are folks like the federal FFIS. I'm forgetting the acronym right now, but they're still publishing their version of the White House Guidebook and updates. So seek those out. As far as data sources go, the administration is certainly going to want to look at what they consider more mainstream data sources. So seek out census data, locally collected data. But I'm not sure there's a right or a wrong answer with this right now. If you've been relying on a particular data set for the last several years to position your community, justify your projects, at this point, just continue to do so to the extent that you can still get access to that data.
Great. And we're getting, I think there's a lot of questions where I wish Matt was in a good position to answer them. I'm not sure you can say much more than you've already said. I think a lot of people are asking about, where can I get the information on what's frozen, what's happening with the agencies? Is there one place to visit? My sense is no, that there isn't sort of this comprehensive way of being able to figure out what's been frozen and unfrozen right now, and where the agencies are at in interpreting the guidance. But Matt, any additional pearls you can share there?
Just really lean on the associations, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and National League of Cities, have folks that are doing this full time around the clock, and have running list of the latest and greatest. So would encourage you to visit their websites and reach out to them for their staff. Now is a really critical time for cities and towns to not go it alone. You really need to rely on those associations to get you the latest and greatest. There are some private individuals and some consulting firms that have trackers. While that might be some sort of helpful background information, I would encourage you not to rely on it, because stuff is getting outdated so quickly. So somebody might put something up there 3 days ago and something's already changed. So really work with the associations.
We also got a question. Thank you, Matt. While we're still answering questions, we're going to put up some poll questions. Please do fill them out. It's going to ask you, amongst other things, how can we help you? As Matt just said, we have incredible partners in this effort in the U.S. Conference of Mayors and National League of Cities, and the local infrastructure hub wants to help you, if whether that's figuring out what the state of play is on your particular grant, or helping you take the steps that you need to take to keep your grant in compliance. We have great experts like Matt and others who we can make available to work through that with you as a city, and let you know, if we know, what's come next. There's a question about when are we gonna start to see these funding opportunities? And I think we have a lot of crystal balling happening. But I'll just say to folks that as soon as any notice of funding opportunities are posted on IJIP programs, we are going to be spinning very quickly into action on the local infrastructure hub and putting out information for you on the changes that we expect to see between the criteria from the last NOFO to this one. I think we have some good trail markers from the changes that were made from raise to build. And so just really stay tuned, because as soon as those funding opportunities come out, we're going to be working with the new administration really to understand their priorities and how you can put your best foot forward in applying for those grants.
One
Anything?
of the things that happened with the recent continuing resolution is they had to pick, as they were negotiating, pick one or the other. So it was either pick congressional earmarks or pick level funding of programs. And what was actually selected was the level funding of programs. And why that's kind of interesting is, congressional earmarks, when they're approved, are not net new appropriations. They're directed funding. So they're telling somebody like CDBG at, HUD, that of your total community development block grant allocation for the fiscal year, these 20 projects get funded out of that pot of money. Well, that directed funding is off the table, but the CDBG program is still funded at its full. So what we're going to see is some interesting programs come out with higher allocations, or maybe additional funding creates a new program. So while I know there are quite a few cities and towns very disappointed about the loss of earmarks, there will be some opportunities, and these are some of the conversations that you should be having with your congressional delegations, both House members and Senate members, saying, hey, we had worked together, really closely on this directed funding, this earmark. It didn't make it. I know program X is going to be fully funded. How can we position ourselves, make sure that when the program's released, the selection criteria, whatever, aligns with our program? So those are some of the strategic conversations you should be having right now. And there's a question about, do U.S. senators have a seat at the table? And absolutely, they do. So it's interesting that I'm based in Kansas City, and even some of the more conservative Republican senators are now realizing what things like cutting USAID programs does, because there's a lot of wheat and corn and soybean from the Midwest that actually gets distributed internationally through USAID. So regardless of party, regardless of house, those are conversations you should be having right now.
Matt, Dave Gatton here from the Conference of Mayors. I've been awarded a grant. I'm a city. I've been awarded a grant, but I don't have a signed grant agreement. What are my options? At what point, if I've contacted the agency 2 or 3 times, not gotten an answer, not in any sort of productive discussion about a grant agreement, where do I sit? How do I analyze that situation?
So when a federal funder, a grantor agency, makes award decisions, even before you as the grantee, as the applicant finds out, they send press releases to the congressional offices. And they say, hey, Congresswoman so-and-so, we're about to announce an award in your district. It's going to be 500,000. It's going to be for this purpose, which allows that congressional representative to be prepared, to get their own press release ready, maybe put an event together, talk to the media, yada, yada, yada. So that's happened. So these federal grantor agencies have put these congressional leaders in a position of having already gone public to talk about the award that was made, how their advocacy helped secure the award, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Federal funders, grantor agencies do not like the wrath coming back from those congressional leaders. They sit on certain committees. They have impact on operations, over that federal agency. So that's why it's critical. You got the award letter, you got the award announcement, but you haven't gotten the grant agreement. Go right to that local congressperson and say, hey, your office announced this, you got the release, the same time we got the release, we haven't gotten a grant agreement yet, and let them go back to the federal agency and try to get that released. That being said, until you have a signed grant agreement, you did not receive the grant. So under no circumstances, extend your organization, start procurement activities, spending money, because that grant agreement is the legal document that gets things over the hurdle. But I can't tell you, having been a former Justice Department employee, the number one thing we tried to avoid was being on the front page of the newspaper for doing something stupid. The second thing we tried to avoid is hearing from a congressional office because they were upset because we put them in a bad position. And when you announce a grant award and then you don't follow through with it, you put that congressional leader in a bad position. So really, pull that lever and pull it as often as you have to get these grants across the finish line. The other thing is, because of some of the staff layoffs, there honestly aren't some people sitting in seats that need to be there to get grant agreements finalized. So we've heard Federal Highway Administration, the regional offices literally don't have the people to fill out the grant agreements, or the general counsel that needs to bless them, or the environmental person that needs to do the review. There's nobody in that seat. So don't think that not hearing back from them is always bad news. It's in many instances they're just trying to figure out who they can get to sign off on certain things.
I know we're at time, but if you have a few more minutes and could go long, for anyone who needs to log off, thank you for attending. We're going to be reviewing the poll results and being in touch with you. If there's anything specific that you asked for, we'll be in touch. You can always reach out to us as well. And we'll be sharing information as soon as there's additional funding opportunities announced about applying for those. We got some questions, Matt, and you mentioned in your response to Dave, really not incurring costs until you sort of are further along in the grant agreement process. We know that a lot of cities are incurring costs, or the costs of their projects are going up because of some of these pauses. How should cities be thinking about those increased costs because of the delays or costs that they might suffer by losing a contractor, for instance?
At some point, a project is no longer viable with or without the grant funds coming from the federal government, and that is something that is a conversation the city and town needs to have about, is this something we are going to do, with or without the grant? Is it important to our community? And if we ultimately have to backfill it with, local general fund dollars, we will, because of the inflationary pressure, because of supply chain issues. anecdotally, I've done some site visits of projects, and they got a $500,000 grant, but the delays caused by the grant increased the cost of the project by $2 million. At some point, the cost benefit analysis no longer makes sense. So really, is it something the city and town was going to do anyways, with or without the grant funds? You have a contractor in hand, you have a bid in hand, things are only going to get more expensive. Does it make sense for you to move forward? If it does make sense for you to move forward, then still manage it to the standard of a federal grant. Go through, formal procurement, follow uniform guidance. And if the grant funding ultimately comes through, then you can introduce it into the project. But at some point, waiting and waiting and waiting for the hope of a grant program just doesn't make financial sense given the inflationary environment we're in right now.
Thanks, Matt. There's a question that just came in it feels like related to this conversation. What if a grant agreement is unexecuted and we have secured a 4232 to begin on the project? Should we stop incurring costs? I have to admit, I don't know what a 4232 is.
Yeah, and again, I would want a fully executed grant agreement. That really is the legal document. If you're, working with a local field office and they've made assurances to you and you have, emails, to that extent, and you feel comfortable, then certainly move forward. But the fully executed grant agreement is really the gold standard for knowing that, everything's going to move forward.
Great. We gotten another question about the EPA general terms and conditions that were apparently updated today, and whether those affect existing grant agreements. I don't know if that's something you're well positioned to answer.
It was about 15 minutes before this session started. I saw the same email, and I haven't digged into it. I would like to hope that it's for, grants being executed after the implementation, but I really need to read, and maybe we'll get an answer back to folks later on about it. Great.
Yeah, we'll be sending, as I mentioned before, to folks, we'll be sending a summary of some of this great guidance from Matt, and if there's changes that come out in the meantime. Maybe just a real practical question. Someone asked, I heard you say that some grants are coming through sam.gov, not grants.gov. Was that?
Yeah, and if I said that, I apologize. What I was talking about was the FFATA reporting, the Federal Financial Accountability and Transparency Act reporting that we had been doing through the FSRS system. That's all being consolidated into sam.gov. So grants.gov as being the grant research pursuance portal for the federal government is not changing. It's sam.gov, and why I wanted to highlight that is while we're looking at individual programs and policy changes from the federal government, in the background, the nuts and bolts of federal grants are changing as well. So obviously last October we had the uniform guidance revisions. They're now being impacted. We're having FSRS being consolidated into sam.gov. We're seeing changes at GSA. We're seeing more consolidation at the HHS Office of Grants versus OMB. So while it's important to be looking at the executive orders and OMB memos and everything else, also know that those fundamental grants activities in the background are also changing, and those are the things that are most likely going to trip you up from a compliance perspective. And again, you need to keep these grants in compliance no matter what.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Matt. As you might notice, you have lots of fans in the chat. Thank you for sharing what we know now. And we'll be coming back to you all as soon as we know more and we can share strategies. But thanks everyone. Thank you, Matt, for this great information. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. And in the meantime, stay in compliance. Bye-bye.